Managing a PR crisis in China, now this is thoughtful. Hello, I'm Kitty Boo in Shanghai. We often talk about the power and popularity of social media platforms on Thoughtful China, but usually we look at how marketers can better use them to grow brands. But there's another aspect to the explosion of microblogging that's far more challenging. Microblogs have come to play a pivotal role not only in brand marketing, but also in breaking and amplifying crises and scandals. They disseminate news and guide public opinion. This week on Thoughtful China, our guests will share advice about how to handle the PR crisis in the microblog era, common triggers for PR problems, and strategies to avoid them. And I'll share some advice of my own for you, speaking both as a PR executive and a former news reporter in China. But first with us today is Michael Chu, managing partner at Ogilvy PR. Michael, welcome to our show.
Thank you for the invitation.
Microblogs are now the main platform for disseminating news and also guiding public opinion. And sometimes the severity of a crisis is actually determined on how widely it's spread on microblogs and also how long it lingers. How should companies be changing their internal structure, organization in terms of HR and training, or in other words, internal communications, to make themselves better equipped for a crisis like this?
Let's start with the main takeaways from this paper we drafted. We started 50 cases happened in 2012, and the most important findings is that if a company can get themselves ready and make the first response within 8 hours, that most probably they will achieve the best results. Obviously, there are many different factors need to take into considerations. In order for a company to respond that quickly within 8 hours, for example, in McDonald's case, they actually respond in 2 hours, less than 2 hours. That requires the company's organization to be more flexible and to be more ready in terms of having these crisis management systems in place. That requires them, for example, if you are a multinational company, you need to have that approval. For example, if you need to go back to the headquarters, you need to respond really quickly.
There should be internal procedure there, and internal sort of
procedures
structure.
There. You need to have we call them scenarios. Yeah. I'm pretty sure that in McDonald's case, they are not drafting that statements when they just heard about the incident, but rather they have similar scenarios ready. In that scenarios, they have a statement ready, so they don't need to go again back to headquarters for that type of approvals.
So we talked to McDonald's quite a bit just now. Obviously what happened on March 15th. Yeah. A lot of people in this business say that's actually a very good example to illustrate how a crisis can be managed.
Right.
But let's now talk about the other side. Talk me through an example of how a crisis that you studied that could have been managed better.
If we talk about managing crisis, in principle, it's very easy to say you need to show care, you need to respond, you need to control the situation, you need to communicate. If we see those failure cases, most of them are making similar mistakes. For example, in Zhou Gui Liquor's case, they first just deny the whole thing. They don't admit their mistakes. Even when the government publicized the test results, they don't really admit they make a mistake in that. I can imagine there are plenty of reasons why doing that. However, from the public side, it's unacceptable, right? And in the Gui Zhentang, they took bile from the live bear. In their case, they use fake fence. It's not new in the microblogs. They use fake fence later exposed by the public. Obviously, everyone will be so angry that how can you as a company, trustworthy company, to do such things? So all these are, and also there Nowadays, in social media areas, if you make a mistake, the mistake can be amplified in such quick ways. In the Guizhentang case, they claim that the bear actually enjoyed the process of being taking vials from live.
The industry association said it's like turning on a water tap.
Exactly. Then it attracts so much attention, and then it comes into the second phase of a crisis.
The two examples you gave me just now, there's a similarity there, which is both companies, instead of facing the problem, looking into it, carry out investigation and reassuring the public that, look, we take this very seriously, we're looking into it. They both chose a way to look away from the problem. You know, one was accused of fake fans, and the other was simply just come out denying everything. Right. Would you say that a common mistake that a lot of companies make in a situation of crisis is that they try not to deal with the problem, but instead try to find other ways to avoid it?
Absolutely, absolutely. It also reflects the major mistake, or the major downside is that most of the companies are not ready for such situations. They don't have a system in place. They don't know whom should make the final decision. They don't have enough information around these potential issues. That's why they want to deny, they want to hide away, they want to pretend it doesn't really happen.
Moving on to fast food companies, we've talked about McDonald's, and now KFC is also under severe public scrutiny. And one of the dangers operating in China is that sometimes an individual case could be quickly escalated to an industry issue. So is there a danger that other food companies will be also under fire this year, in your opinion? And to your knowledge, is the fast food industry trying to work together to fix these issues at the moment? If not, should they be working together?
It's not just the fast food company, it's rather the whole food and beverage industry. We have listed the top 10, in our research paper, we have listed the top 10 cases related to the brand. And out of that top 10, 8 are associated with food industries. Obviously, after the melamine issues, food attracts so much attention. So the risk of any food companies, I would say, is much higher than other industries. Yes, we do see that especially in food industries, any individual cases can expand into industrial cases. The liquor, the Chinese liquor, Zhougui is the same case. It starts with Zhougui, then it goes into like Maotai, like different brands. And so people are very concerned about food in general, and that's why the risk for the food companies are much higher than others.
Thanks, Michael. Stay tuned. I'll be right back with a thought or two with my own about how to handle a PR crisis. I have a relatively unique perspective on crisis management. I worked as a journalist in China for 8 years, during which I covered issues surrounding companies. And now I work in the communications sector, helping companies deal with such crises. In my experience, the biggest mistake a company can make is to remain silent or give only a no comment that will only give both journalists covering the story and the public who are reading the story the impression that the company doesn't care enough about the issue. Even worse, it might give the impression that the company is guilty, because silence can often be taken to be an acknowledgement of guilt. Better, in my experience, is to craft at least some sort of holding response in the early stages of a crisis. Something that journalists can fit into their stories that shows the company's concern about the issue and the seriousness with which it takes it. It doesn't have to be complicated or long, but preparing oneself early on with at least a basic response tends to go a long way in helping you get ahead of a story, rather than falling behind it and letting it take on a life of its own. Welcome back. With me now in the studio are Brian Cronkite, Managing Director, Burson-Marsteller, Shanghai, Francis Sun, Managing Director, EBCO, and John McPherson, Director, Crisis and Security Consulting, Greater China at Control Risks. So let's imagine if Yum brand is in our studio today. What piece of advice would you give them at this moment? I mean, the issue is still hot; it's still in the news at the moment. What advice would you give them?
Without kind of talking specifically about Yum, I think managing suppliers in China is a huge challenge, and you can't kind of just wait for a problem to come and then address it with the suppliers. You have to be able to demonstrate that you have a robust monitoring, auditing, screening process in place. There's a lot of pressure on companies to make sure that they have robust compliance programs with their suppliers, and I think you need to expect that you'll have a problem with your supply chain, and you need to be able to demonstrate when you do have a problem that you've taken all the steps that you can to prevent problems from happening.
I think adding on to that point, I mean, interestingly, a lot of what Yum's done has been operating within the scope of the law in the first instance of the crisis, but that doesn't really matter in terms of public opinion. If you look at their product, I would venture to say that their product is probably as good or safer than 90% of the other products out there. But when there's problems with chicken supply and you're a chicken manufacturer that's super prominent, you're the poster child for this issue. I think that there's an opportunity for them to not just manage the crisis, but take action to resolve it. And probably working with the supply chain, working with partners, working with the industry to not be the sole responsible for this, but to kind of broaden the discussion, lead some sort of change to make things safer, and be a part of that change, I think is a huge opportunity for them.
Yeah, I agree. I think what applies to Yum applies to all companies. That's some of the principles. I think the first crisis happens to good company, to bad companies, and to good companies. So when we conduct training to crisis to companies, we always say crisis is not about if, it's about when. So even for, I believe Yum is a good company, it happens. The first, most of the company, the instant reaction is to deny. They need to know that they are not handling the lawsuit. They are handling the public panic. They are managing the expectation from various stakeholders. It takes different skills.
And even in cases where there is no problem with your products, so there's no problem with chicken.
That happens too sometimes.
It happens all the time, and you have to manage the perception and the context. And in China, it's a context of deep-seated concern about food safety.
That's why a PR industry exists, in addition to law firm.
Mm-hmm.
It takes different skills.
And what Brian was mentioning is really important to use a crisis and then focus on recovery. And so if you're a chicken restaurant and there's a crisis in the chicken industry, using that to improve the standards of chicken across the entire industry can help you recover the brand in a much broader sense.
Yeah, if they did such a thing, I think they'd have an opportunity to potentially build greater customer loyalty and actually turn this into a positive.
Yeah, sometimes crisis strikes, and then it could be an opportunity, it could be a challenge, and it's good to look on the bright side. And let's walk away from Yum for a little bit. I want to ask you, is there a difference between local companies and global MNCs though? I mean, we often see cases in China where international companies are under very serious scrutiny in the public court of opinion, for example. So in terms of taking a hit from the public image issues, who takes the harder hit?
I would venture to say that MNCs probably are more scrutinized. And I say that also acknowledging the fact that if you're a Chinese company operating in the US, you may undergo more scrutiny as well. It's inevitable political dynamics. I also think if you're a journalist in China working with Chinese media, it's a little bit more fair game and probably a safer territory to scrutinize an international brand than a loved local national brand.
I would say the people in China have a higher expectation on multinational companies than local companies. So they have a high expectation, so they demand more, they hope more. So in that point, we can say so multinational companies are more vulnerable. But in another word, if you see, you can see many crises happen to local companies. And some of the local companies just bankrupt, just went nowhere because of crisis hit. Rarely you can see multinational companies went bankruptcy or just failed because of a crisis hit. So you can see multinational companies, even though more vulnerable in China by the crisis, public scrutiny, but they are more stronger. They have better crisis management system to make them sustainable, to make them can go through the crisis and sometimes become even stronger.
I think that's beginning to change, though. I think local companies are becoming more and more focused on how they manage risk and how they manage issues and how they prevent crises. So just in the last kind of 2 years, the amount of work we've done with local companies who are very concerned about the reputation of their suppliers or the reputation of their potential joint venture partners, the requests we get to do due diligence by Chinese companies on Chinese companies has dramatically increased. The amount of political research and political risk assessments we're doing for Chinese companies working overseas, they are really trying to catch up and develop sophisticated risk management systems and response systems, because they're beginning to realise that that's how you build a sustainable business in high risk markets.
Now let's take a question from actually one of our fans on Sina Weibo, Feng Yan Lan Yu, who asks how PR and marketing can be coordinated well from online to offline, and whether you have any good tips to integrate social media with offline activities.
Oh, that's a big. It takes another 2 hours.
I mean, yeah, I think it's a question that probably requires a significant explanation, but to kind of give a little shorthand, I mean, there's a number of scenarios where, again, if I look at a lot of clients that work with in consumer space, where marketing and communications needs to work very closely together. So whether you have certain promotional campaigns that have an online component that drive people into a store and then have some sort of interactive bit to then bring that back online, there's a lot of kind of ways to have a very fluid approach in terms of how you integrate the two.
I think when you design a plan of a campaign, it's about messaging. So what kind of messaging you want your stakeholder, your consumer, or participant to get. Those messaging need to be consistent, no matter online or offline. So you need to design, and then you need to monitor the process, the events, you need to response. So it takes just the managing. I think it's just what PR. So what PR is.
I think it's really important that you have a social media presence before a crisis, and that needs to be part of the communication infrastructure. It needs to be owned by the senior leadership, so it can't be owned just by the marketing team or by the communications team. The most senior leaders of your business need to take ownership and responsibility for your online presence, and you need to have that all ready to go, before a crisis.
Okay, Brian, Francis, and John, thank you so much for being at Thoughtful China today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Such a pleasure.
That wraps it up for today. Be sure to subscribe to us on Tudo and YouTube. You can also follow us on Weibo and Twitter and join our LinkedIn group. See you again.